From Preparation to Competition, presented by Dr. Jessica Mahler. My name is Veronica Allen, and I'm with the Division Services Office of the American Psychological Association. Before I give you to Dr. Christensen, who will be our moderator for the day, just let me give you a couple of housekeeping questions, a couple of housekeeping issues. All of you are participating in this webinar and will be muted given the vast popularity of our webinar. So if you need to ask any questions, please do so by using the question box in your control panel. Also, please be aware that there will be a question and answer period at the end of the webinar around 1:50, and the questions will be asked by Dr. Christensen to Dr. Mahler, and Dr. Mahler will be responding the questions. And without further ado, I introduce to you Dr. Dolores Christensen. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Veronica. Hello, everyone. My name is Dolores Christensen. I'm currently a doctoral student, not quite a doctor yet, but a doctoral student at Springfield College, and I'm one of the Division 47 student representatives to the Executive Committee. On behalf of my fellow student rep, Julie Wieselmeyer, who is at Seattle Pacific University, we are so pleased and excited to have this webinar and to have Dr. Jessica Mahler with us today. First, I want to thank the Division 47 Executive Committee for their support, Veronica for your support in many emails, and also the Association for Applied Sports Psychology for co-sponsoring this webinar. Of course, we definitely want to thank Dr. Mahler for joining us today. She is a clinical and sports psychologist and is the current coordinator of sports psychology services at the U.S. Naval Academy. She provides both counseling and mental skills training to student athletes, teams, and specialized military groups. While most of her work focuses on applied performance excellence and consulting with individuals and teams, she is also involved in psychophysiological research to help better understand cognitive workload and performance. Dr. Mahler is a member of the Association for Applied Sports Psychology, where she holds certified consultant status, and she is a member of the U.S. Olympic Committee's Sports Psychology Registry for the current quadrennium. Thank you all for joining us, and I'd like to turn it over now to Dr. Mahler.
Hello. I am incredibly excited today to be able to speak to the group about student-athlete mental health from preparation to execution or preparation to competition. This is my first opportunity to actually give a webinar. I've only ever been an attendee, so this is even more exciting for me to be able to do this via the web. I'm going to give a little disclosure at first. I'm at the Naval Academy. The federal government has some rules around that. And so I'm going to say first that these are my ideas. Actually, there are a lot of ideas of my fellow colleagues and wonderful mentors I've had throughout my career. But they're not the ideas of the United States Naval Academy. So I'm giving my little caveat at the beginning. I'm actually going to start with a story. I'm going to start with a story about a track athlete. I've kind of made up a name. His name is going to be Scott Smith for this story. He started track in 8th grade. He enjoyed running. His parents signed him up to participate, like lots of our student athletes, kind of get started with mom and dad or somebody in their life getting them started in their sport. He had fun running on the team. He made friends. He did well. He actually made the varsity team by high school in 10th grade. Making that team, I think, made him work harder as he realized he might even be able to run in college. His times were good enough, he thought, to continue on in his career. In 11th grade, he actually began getting recruited. He continued to perform well, winning state meets, getting A's in academics. He's a little bit of a perfectionist in his training and meets most of his goals as a high school athlete. So that's the start of the story, and I'm going to come back to the story as I present today. I'm going to begin with this idea of psychological performance excellence. So you have some idea about where I'm coming from when I begin to talk about student-athlete mental health and this idea of performance excellence. So Jones et al. Has a nice definition. I think it makes sense with a lot of the athletes that we work with as well. And that it essentially is having this natural or developed edge. I like the way that that's put, because it lets you know that there's some of this maybe comes from a bit of genetics, right? It's just kind of part of who the person is, but we actually get to develop it. A big role for us is in sports psychology. That these psychological performance excellence is really when someone can generally cope better than their opponent within many demands that sport brings: competition, training, lifestyle, and to also be more consistent and better than your opponents, and being determined, focused, confident, and in control under pressure. Bob Harbison, also in one of my citations here, expanded on this in a chapter that I'm going to, actually my next slide's also going to speak to. And he talked about this performance excellence, that we can look at it in kind of this confidence, summoning motivation and desire, dealing with adversity, overcoming pain and hardship, managing pressure and emotions, being able to stay focused, and finding balance. So another way in which he kind of began to expand on achieving this confidence and dealing with adversity and staying focused was through a behavioral signature. And I often use this when talking with athletes. So your behavioral signature is essentially your situation that happens, it may be out of your control, your response, and this is where the signature is really the kind of most important part of it, and that leads to an outcome. It's essentially a series of if-thens that occur. And when I talk about somebody's behavioral signature, I often just relate it to somebody's handwriting and your own signature when you write your name, on the dotted line. And I actually can reflect back on my own experience and my own handwriting. So I don't know how many of you in the audience have good handwriting. I can tell you I'm not one of the ones who has good handwriting. In fact, I have awful handwriting. And when I think about my awful handwriting, you know what? I kind of attribute it to my dad, right? Because my dad, well, he had really bad handwriting. And so I kind of say, well, genetically speaking, my dad must have given me my bad handwriting. And that's all right. However, my mom was also part of the process. And she had beautiful handwriting. It was so flowy and always looked nice. And she would always say that she had good handwriting because she practiced it over and over and over again. That in her grade school, it was really important they have good handwriting, and so she continued to practice it. So we can kind of look at sometimes this behavioral signature, both being part of who we are, kind of this genetic piece, and then also we can train it, right? Through practice, through deliberate practice, we can actually train our behavioral signature and begin to change it. So, it's interesting. So I don't have good handwriting, as I said, but if you hand me a "Hello, my name is" sticker, and on that sticker I have got to write, Dr. Jessica Moeller on my sticker, something happens, right? Because now, the sticker is going to be, everybody's going to be able to see it, and they're going to maybe look at me and think oh, I need to be able to read her name, and I want them to be able to read my name. And so I do this interesting thing. I slow down, I focus, I concentrate, and amazingly enough, I end up with a Dr. Jessica Moeller that looks very neat and tidy, and people can read it. Yet, right, if I'm just having to write my name really quickly, my kind of normal habits are to have messy handwriting. And so we can, I think, look at this behavioral signature in a very similar way. What are an athlete's kind of normal habits? What are they going to turn to normally, right, when stress comes on or when pressure kind of arises? And how have they practiced potentially doing something else, right, changing that response so they end up with a different outcome? And that's kind of that series of if-thens, right? So knowing as an athlete, if this happens, then this happens, we have an opportunity to begin to change it so that we get the outcome we actually want as athletes. Another way to kind of look at this idea is through this kind of funnel effect. And I actually really like this model. And one of the reasons I like looking at it this way as well is because as a sports psychologist, I'm looking to intervene. Like, I'm looking to develop interventions so that it can be effective and help the athletes I work with perform better more consistently. And I divide it in, now I only have 3 kind of divisions here, but I actually look at 4. So first is this idea of cognition, right? So we can change the way in which an athlete thinks. right? That can be that response. They can have a different response in that moment. We can change the way an athlete behaves, okay, again, and that will potentially affect the outcome of performance. Affect. So affect for me is kind of two pieces. Affect is both emotion or feelings, which again, we can kind of begin to understand what is an athlete's ideal mindset. If we look at Hannon's work about the individual zone of optimal functioning, right, we can begin to understand what is the ideal feeling state for this athlete when they perform their best. And as well as part of that affect is their psychophysiology. So how do we understand heart rate, breathing rate, heart rate variability, brain waves? Now, I'm not sure an athlete's ever going to feel their brain waves, but they're going to begin to understand what that sensation is when they're high-level performance or when they've achieved their optimal mindset. And this is where all the mental skills, as I use them, get applied. Am I looking to change the way an athlete thinks? And how might I do that? Right? I may use imagery at times. Right? I may use just general self-talk, creating cues to change the way an athlete speaks to themselves. And this all has to do with the response the athlete has. So why, and one of the reasons I like using the graphic of this funnel is that it gets at this idea to me is that we are actually looking to narrow down as we move towards performance. And I want to come back to this later in my talk. But there's this idea of narrowing in and narrowing down as we begin to look towards making our athletes more efficient. Right? And efficiency is certainly one of my main goals in working in athletes when I'm talking about performance, right, is letting the athlete become efficient. And part of my graduate training, I was at University of Maryland at College Park, where I had a professor, Dr. Brad Hatfield, and I'm actually going to cite some of his research in my next slide. But that opportunity, way back when now, got me looking more at efficiency and how do we understand the brain and efficiency. And I think those experiences, again, lend this idea that the brain is really this command center. It controls everything we do. And that how it functions really affects an athlete's control of focus, right? It controls the reaction time. It may control the quality of your sleep, which is, a central part of performance. It has a role in motor movement, and it's what I'm going to talk about next, this kind of efficiency of motor movement. It's involved in emotional reactivity, and certainly the ability to mentally recover after an error. So efficiency ends up becoming this really important part of high-level athletes and high-level athletics to get an athlete to perform better. Most often, they're also performing more efficiently. Right? As we think of these athletes now as these kind of thinker and doer, an athlete is certainly the doer, not a thinker. There are times when they think, right? And you're going to get that from my title, right? From preparation to execution, or from preparation to competition. Now, at preparation time, there may be a lot of thinking, but when it's time to execute, right? When I'm working with an athlete, I'm looking to how do I just simply make them a doer. Another way to kind of add on to this, and this is a little bit of a busy slide, but I thought I was doing a webinar, and so you guys are all looking this on your computer screen, so I could put all this information up there for you. These are 3 studies that I look at. They're ones that make sense to me in terms of understanding efficiency in the athletes that we work with. This first one that I'm going to kind of talk about, and maybe it's because it actually had occurred at the academy that I'm a little partial to that first study. They're looking at small bore rifle, comparison between skilled riflemen and experts. Okay, so between skilled and experts, and what they found is as the expert athletes, as they approached the moment of trigger pull as they shot on a target, that the brains changed. It changed right before trigger pull, but there was a change in their brain waves prior to trigger pull. And in fact, that's become kind of, they've been able to look at this in such a specific way that now we can even see, we can begin to predict, right, which are going to be successful trigger pulls and which aren't going to be successful trigger pulls. Within the skilled athletes, there was not much change all the way through trigger pull, right? The brain wasn't really shifting, right? And so with experts, right, we see this shift to this kind of more economical way of activation, right? There's alpha wave, asymmetrically activated, so only one side's activated. You really see this efficient process occur in these highly expert athletes. And that again speaks this idea that there's kind of this funnel as we move to competition, right? We're looking to be more simple, less complex. The next study by Beckman also kind of got at this idea and looked at the idea of choking. And this was actually on the Div47 listserv at one point. I think that's where I originally got this article. Now, a couple of years ago, it was in 2013. I think it's a great article looking at efficiency and what happens in the brain when somebody has successful performance. And they could look that actually by stimulating the brain physically, right, through holding something in one hand, they could actually prime better performance in high-pressure situations. Right? So this, again, this kind of efficiency that seems to occur when pressure is on, in fact, is so ideal to performance and helps an athlete really perform to their best. This kind of last study in here, which now again I'm citing myself a bit, but I think it's really neat stuff, and then there's such to me an overlap between military and sport performance. And let me tell you, I am one of the last authors on this work. I'm a helper in this work that's going on. We looked at aviation. We looked at aviators in an aviation simulated environment. You can see in that picture in the upper left-hand side, right? Looking at brain waves, and in particular, looking at mental load, cognitive workload, and what we're able to see that as the pressure increases or as the situation becomes more complex, they have to manage more information, do more. What happens is, right, the brain, we can actually begin to read that the brain gets overloaded at times. We can see performance decrease, and as that performance decreases, we can see the corresponding brain changes that goes along with that. Again, speaking to this idea that if we can get an athlete to be more efficient when there's complex things going on around them, they're going to be able to perform better. Only pay attention to the things they have to pay attention to, not pay attention to and focus on tasks that are irrelevant to the mission. All these studies get at this idea of efficiency and lead us to that there's these really wonderful ways in which we can intervene in an athlete and a student athlete's process potential of improvement. So I'm going to head a bit back to this story that I started off with. So Scott, he's now a sophomore in college. His freshman year was all right. He didn't run quite as fast as he wanted to, but he got used to the college environment and began to make friends. He kind of thought, well, I'm a freshman, I'm not exactly necessarily supposed to perform my best, but, I'm adjusting and figuring out this process. His body didn't quite seem used to the intensity of training at the college level. It was hard. The intensity definitely increases often when an athlete moves from the high school level to the college level. As well, with a kind of newfound freedom of college. I don't think we have that freedom here at the Naval Academy, but at most schools, right, you get that newfound freedom of college. He stayed up later, didn't always eat well, may have done some other activities, didn't lead to the best performance ever. However, now he's a sophomore. He has bigger goals this year, higher expectations. He really starts the year well. He's committed to both training, and he sees improvements in training. He's committed to it prior to the season's start. He's doing the captain's practices that he needs to. He's also committed to the lifestyle habits. I think sometimes those are overlooked as sports psychologists, or even, I shouldn't say sports psychologists, but as athletes, that those lifestyle habits are sometimes just as mentally tough to adhere to as the competitive, the moment of competition. But he's committed to them. He's doing the right lifestyle habits that go along with training to improve performance. His season starts, and he begins to travel to meets, right? Kind of getting his feet wet, learning more about the environment, what it's like to travel. His times continue, and he's not really improving much, right? And he hasn't really had any big changes in his times, decreases in his times. As he's competed at meets. And he gets kind of increasingly worried before races because he really wants to improve his time. This was his year to be a good performer, right? Freshman year, he knew he was adjusting. Now is his time to really shine as an athlete. And each race is really this opportunity to improve. He feels like it's really not working. He's begun to sacrifice some of his study time as an athlete, and thinking that if I sacrifice a little more study time, get a little more sleep, and train harder, maybe my performance will improve. So now his grades aren't as good. So he's not performing as well. His grades have taken a bit of a hit. And, he feels like coach really doesn't have a lot of time for him. In high school, his coach spent a ton of time helping him train, understanding him individually as an athlete. But now this coach, he just doesn't quite have the time that he used to have. He gets a bit irritated with team members who are making their times. He doesn't really quite feel like being around them as much as he used to. His athletic trainer, she begins to notice that something's a bit different. He seems a little more to himself. He doesn't seem quite as outgoing as he used to be. And so she checks in with him. Scott tells her that he's really frustrating. Nothing seems to be going well, and he doesn't know how to fix it. So she refers him to the sports psychologist. And I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide, and I'll continue with the story in a little bit. So now I've talked a lot about performance and how I see performance and my point in my career. And now I'm going to begin to add this other piece to just kind of the athlete, and that is the student. There's variability from school to school. I've already mentioned a bit of some of the variability of a USNA student athlete potentially versus a different student athlete. There's variability from sport to sport, the time of year that the competition occurs, the unique physical and psychosocial demands that kind of come with this year-round training potentially that's now going on, the competition, the travel, even increasing pressures to perform, both academically and on the track, as I'm going to talk about Scott. And all these things can kind of come together and have an impact, can kind of compromise mental and physical health. The student athletes that we work with, they have to learn how to balance these numerous demands, right, with these expectations from multiple people, school, sports, social. They're also just personally developing in new ways, and this is happening really on a daily basis, right? These stresses and these pressures are constantly shifting, and in addition, and this is where Scott's story I think I'm trying to highlight a bit of, is that many of our student athletes have really been meeting their goals until they get to college. In fact, it's how they got to this next level in sport is because they were high performers and were in fact noticed for their high performance, potentially in sport and academics, or sport academics and leadership. Right? They began to get noticed, and now they're in an environment where they're not the best. They're having to shift a bit in the way that they think of themselves potentially. They're now they're one of many great athletes and students that they're surrounded by, and this can be hard for a student athlete, for a 17, 18-year-old, 19-year-old to cope with as they transition. This achievement orientation appears for that younger group, at least in my experience so far, is so often performance-based. There's kind of this performance orientation versus a mastery-based orientation. And as we see student athletes transition to the next level, I think that this sometimes interferes with that transition and can make it a little bit harder if it's not addressed in an effective way. So what does this do, right, to the student athletes then that we're working with? It potentially puts them at a bit of higher risk. Etzel et al. In 2006 has a great article that's actually written to student affairs professionals, people actually in the counseling centers, and in those types of roles. And I think it's a great article that begins to really address what are we seeing among our student athletes, and how the pressures might be different. I think my original feeling about athletics when I first began my path to becoming a sports psychologist was that athletics was a protective factor. It really provided, these were healthy These were healthy athletes, right? And being part of a team was somehow protective. And I think there still are parts of being an athlete that are protective. And I may even mention some of those later on, that there is a bit of that protection. However, I also think that there's pieces of participating in college athletics that also creates this higher risk, right? These are some of them, right? So this alcohol use shift that we tend to see in college athletes, potentially disordered eating habits, maybe some of that perfectionism and how it bleeds into the way in which they choose their food. Injury, training loads, increasing training loads, expectations of good performance and having injury occur. The academic pressures that can go along with being a student athlete, they have to be worried about a lot of different domains. Overtraining in itself, right, creates mood impact and can be detrimental. And then one of the things I'm pretty passionate about is sleep, not just my own, but also the people I work with. And that this lack of sleep that I know we see here and that I know is seen really nationwide among our college student athletes, that it can really have an impact and make our student athletes at higher risk, potentially for mental health concerns. So nicely, the NCAA is very well aware of this and has done a lot over the last multiple years. I've become, I think, just more knowledgeable about what they're doing in the last few years. In particular, for this presentation, I got an opportunity to speak with both Lydia Bell from the NCAA research arm and Mary Wilford, and some of you may know of them. They're doing incredible work looking at student-athlete experience and how that impacts both mental health and well-being. So it's really good that we're getting an opportunity to kind of look at these factors. Before I even kind of get into these factors, the timing of this presentation was fortuitous for me, in that last week President Mark Emmert from the NCAA was actually on campus for a basketball event, and so he met with people on campus and to learn more about what we're doing here, and I certainly had an opportunity to listen to him and speak to him. And he really pointed out some interesting things about the NCAA, and some of you may already know this. It was good information for me to hear. In particular, one of the things I was struck by is that he kind of spoke about how he's often compared to people like the NFL commissioner or the NBA commissioner. And he made this, I thought, really good point about that. His purpose is not entertainment, which is really potentially the NFL and the NBA. His is not entertainment. His purpose is student-athlete development. And where the NBA and NFL maybe have 30 some odd teams apiece, right, and maybe 500 athletes apiece, the NCAA and what his work does, I think he said, and I don't want to quote him too specifically because I didn't write down the numbers, but it was over 19,000 sports he represents, and over 400,000 student athletes are part of the NCAA. Such an enormous number of students that he's representing in terms of thinking about their wellness and well-being and what's best for them. And so the NCAA is able to do some really important work. And he also kind of mentioned that so many people's perception of the NCAA is the 3%. And so, what we watch on TV, what we see on Saturdays and Fridays and, whatever other day you're watching college sports, that's essentially the 3% of the NCAA. And the other 97% is something that we don't necessarily always pay attention to, and it's just as important for those student athletes. So some of the research they're looking at in terms of this well-being, things that they're focused on in particular, one is the time demands. So that time demands for student athletes are increasing. And in fact, often if athletes are given kind of an extra hour in their day, right, if they're told that 1 hour can be, you get an extra hour, you get a 25-hour day, what are you going to do during that hour? A lot of them say, right, they want to practice a bit more. But you know what a lot of them also say is they just want to sleep. right? And so when we start thinking about student-athlete well-being and time demands, if given an extra hour, they just would want to sleep to recover, how do we begin to let our student-athletes get that hour, right? How do we help them manage their schedule so that they can, commit to the right lifestyle that also contributes to being a good student-athlete? They talk about academic well-being. One of the things that the NCAA has found is that athletes tend, when they're in the classroom, they feel as if at times they are not as kind of well respected for their academic abilities, right? And that can feel kind of pressure as a student athlete, that you're sitting in a classroom and your professor thinks, are you really as prepared as the student sitting next to you who's a non-athlete? And that pressure can be uncomfortable. And so looking at academic well-being. Another piece that they look at is majors, and are student athletes really able to take and pursue the academic careers they want to with their sport, and how that could be really difficult on a student athlete who has a dream, right? The 4 years of college sport's going to end pretty quickly, and they want to achieve something else, but can they actually do that and continue to be a student athlete? Are there classes available for them? Identity. It's something I find is so critical in student athlete development and working with athletes is, how do they identify themselves? What is that identity kind of related to? Are they over-identified as an athlete? They have so many different identities, from athlete to student to child, son, daughter, to romantic relationships, right? Friendships. They have so many different identities, and where does that athletic identity fit in to the way in which they see themselves, so that we can help them grow, right? Develop from not just college student athlete, but also to a healthy person after college, an adult. The NCAA is looking at coaches and how, and in particular, what we think of our coaches. Again, some of their research looking at it specifically, would you choose your school if the coach wasn't there? How much of your college decision are you basing it simply on the coach? And is that really a good decision for a student athlete to only be coach-based? Does it really also need to be about the school? Because what if sport ends? Then where are you? How are you going to adjust to that effectively? Or if the coach leaves, are you still where you want to be as a student athlete? And the last piece the NCAA is looking at in terms of mental health is the social environment or support network. While student athletes do tend to have a lot of support networks, right? Coach, team, they are also at times removed from the larger campus support networks that can be so important in their development. And how do we better allow them to interface with the college community resources and grow from those experiences as they grow from their sport experience? So really good stuff the NCAA is looking at that really highlights that the student-athlete experience is different than the athlete experience, and certainly different than just the student experience. As we begin to work with this group. So this is a little bit of an old slide. Chris Carr, who I have really enjoyed learning from over my career as a sports psychologist, and he presented at an NCAA life skills format and conference, and he noted some of these stats. Now I will say, I'm also again showing a bit of my age because some of these are some old stats, but I didn't put anything up here that I didn't think was still true, and it's not still being seen amongst the people that we're working with. So the student athletes in general, students diagnosed with depression is rising. I can tell you that is all the talk in counseling centers across the country, is that we're seeing higher rates of mental health disorders. It's increasing every year. A third of all college students actually have serious mental health symptoms. That mental health problems occur at equal rates for athletes, and this is also being looked at the NCAA, and they're really finding very similar information. That serious injury in collegiate athletes is a predictor of mental health. We absolutely see that, right? We can see an injured athlete, and you see the response they have. And in fact, right when that injured athlete, is potentially in their first parts of rehab, they might be removed from the team, which is their, social network and support network, and now they're away from them. So more about this kind of college student-athlete process. So we also see higher prevalence of eating disorders, right? I talked a bit about Scott and now his emphasis on lifestyle habits. And when you begin to emphasize on, kind of work towards lifestyle habits, do you work too hard towards it? And you begin to develop eating disorder behavior because you think it's going to improve performance. You can see gambling rate issues certainly among student athletes. Again, the alcohol use has an impact. And then again, this also, so injury can cause mental health problems. It can also, the negative life event, so stress, right, is also predictive of risk of sport injury. So it's really a two-way relationship with injury. So what you're getting, I think, beginning to see this picture of student athletes. And while on one hand, again, such a wonderful experience, and any of you who are in the audience who have been a student athlete, you can probably speak to what an important part of your development and kind of who you are today, how much that was critical to your development and how much you enjoyed it, hopefully. Many of you really enjoyed that experience. But there are some negative impacts, and really you can see this higher stress level that occurs in our student-athlete population, and they have specific needs that it's important to really consider. So I took this slide, not mine. It's McEwen, 1998, and in fact, he's gone on and with another researcher, McEwen and Steller, they really coined this term, allostasis or allostatic load. I think it's an interesting concept, especially in light of how I talked about the behavioral signature and resilience, and that there's a kind of series of if-thens and what's the situation, response, outcome. If we begin to look at this model, right, so allostatic load ends up being really the wear and tear in the body. So the long-term wear and tear in the body, which grows over time when an athlete or when an individual is exposed to repeated chronic stress. Right? They begin to adapt to it. And the neuroendocrinological, I think I've ruined that word a bit, response and neurobiological response that occurs after kind of constant stress can change the way in which we feel and think and behave, and that psychophysiological response we have. And you can see this, from these environmental stressors, major life events, the athlete experience, the student athlete experience, there's some differences there that may come into play that need to be considered. And ultimately, it's the student athlete, they perceive the stress. Like, nobody else owns their stress, right? You can look at one student athlete and say, wow, like, you got a lot going on. You must be really stressed. And that individual is fine, right? They've managed it. They just have, their resources, internal resources, external resources to manage it effectively, and so they feel fine. And yet another student athlete who kind of comes in your door, who you don't feel like has as many stressors, they're not managing it, right? They may feel a sense of helplessness. They may feel a bit threatened, and this kind of constant feeling, right, can really result in these behavioral responses that then leads to a physiological response, and then this kind of constant stress reaction that has long-term impact. So, it's a problem for student athletes, and so then what do we do as a sports psychologist as our student athletes are walking in our door? Right, so I changed my behavioral signature a bit, and I put it in some nice red colors. Oh, and my if-then, that somehow kind of didn't come out exactly right. But so if-then, and this situation to performance, is the response different now? Right, so if we begin to look at the student athlete who's experiencing, right, as Scott experienced, right, he's frustrated. Right? He's not making his times. His academic stress is now mounting because he hasn't put effort towards that endeavor. How now do we begin to change that thought process or that behavior or feeling? Is it harder to get them to change? During the week, are we now talking more about the kind of complicated process potentially that's going on for the student athlete, right? For Scott? Is his if-thens beginning to change? Before, he could cope with these kind of with a couple performance problems and no big deal, and now he has one performance problem and it's the end of the world, right, in the way in which he's seeing it. So, because of these increased stressors, now is this behavioral signature beginning to change, and how do we deal with that as a sports psychologist? One of the things I talk about in particular when an athlete walks in, or a student athlete walks in my office, is the expectation for counseling. Most of the people I see, and I think this is probably, true for any, I'll speak in generalities, that I think this happens across campuses, that a lot of times when a student athlete's walking in your office, they've never experienced counseling before. This is their first time experiencing and needing help in this way. And so creating an expectation of what this is going to look like and what this is going to feel like, I think, can be important as they sit down and we begin to talk. Right, so I may create this expectation, right, that in counseling during the week, we're going to be talking about a lot. In fact, I'm going to have you thinking about a lot and trying to make connections between how you feel, kind of where that feeling potentially comes from, where it's reinforced in your life, right, how we maybe begin to change it. So we're going to be talking about things that are hard. Right? Sometimes I make the analogy that we're, kind of unpacking a box. Those of you who've ever had to move and you know what packing's like. Sometimes when we're in a rush to get packed, right, we throw stuff in a box and we fold the box together so the corners are kind of tucked in. And that works really well most of the time. And sometimes when we go to pick up the box and the stuff inside of it shifts, all of a sudden the box spills open and now everything's falling out. Okay? And I think sometimes that's how kind of the emotional experience can feel for our student athletes, that they kind of try to keep it all together, but it's kind of tucked in, and that at any moment it may come out and it may feel uncomfortable because it's coming out at the wrong time. And I often look at counseling as we're actually purposefully opening that box. And so, in fact, it might be uncomfortable. We might talk about things they're not usually used to talking about. But by the end of our session, when they walk out of here, we're gonna tuck the corners back in so they can walk out and still be all right. They may feel at times a bit more, but it's going to feel a bit more within their control. And that by the end of counseling, my hope, right, is that that box in some ways, right, will be taped shut, and so they can actually make a choice about when they're going to open it and share, and when they're going to close it and keep it to themselves. The memories don't ever go away, or kind of those things that may be in that box don't necessarily leave, but yet we have a different way of experiencing them and sharing them. But I'm going to tell the athlete, like, this is what it's going to look like this is what you're going to expect. But by game time, right, on Saturday or whenever game time is for the athlete, you're going to be thinking about only what's necessary for performance, because during the week, right, we're going to unpack and we're going to think and we're going to feel and we're going to kind of get complicated. And then by the time the weekend comes around, you're going to be thinking about what's necessary for performance. We'll be keeping, you're going to have to only focus on what you need to do in order to meet your goals. And often the expression that I hear coaches use a lot, I hear sports psychologists use it a lot, and that is kind of, what's your job now? And so by the weekend, right, they hopefully have boiled down their job into two to three controllable pieces. This is actually a technique I used. I learned from Dr. Peterson, who used to be at the USOC, and this is a number of years ago that I learned that technique, and it really remains true to the work I do today. When I'm working with an athlete, by the weekend, right, by competitive time, 2 to 3 things that they can do now. So this counseling process, kind of, what, how do athletes begin? So I've talked about it as if kind of athletes are going to be walking in your door, right, frequently, and that it's just going to happen, and they're going to know that your services are there, and they're going to be ready to, okay, I'm going to come in and I'm going to see the sports psychologist. And yet, unfortunately, that's not quite where we are probably in mental health, and certainly not in sports psychology. Oh, wait, sorry, I went ahead and I'm going to have to go ahead a little more. So one way to think about this in particular, I'm going to have to skip ahead even more. One way, a little out of order on my slides, one organization that's looked at this in terms of how to get kind of better access to services for our student athletes is this support for sport. This is actually, Dolores asked me to include this slide because I think this is coming from her college, her university, and I think it's a wonderful resource. I've gone on and explored it. I think it's a great way for athletes to get information, this peer-to-peer help a bit. It's a good resource, and certainly feel free to check it out. The idea is, how do we get our athletes information about mental health resources? And preparing for this presentation and talking with Lydia Bell from the NCAA, she also sent me this resource. It was a 2012 publication from NAMI, the National Institute of Mental Illness, and they asked college students as they were exiting, they asked them their kind of beliefs about mental health support that they received. And there's a lot of good information in the report. One thing that stuck out to me in particular is how do we do outreach? In this survey, they asked these athletes, not student athletes, but athletes, how important is it for colleges to offer mental health awareness activities? And an overwhelmingly large number said, right, it's extremely important. And the top rated intervention that these college students who were leaving college because of mental health concerns rated was that, the top rated intervention was faculty and staff training, right? So that our faculty and staff understand mental health and how to probably recognize mental health, how to provide support, how to get the student that they're sitting in their classroom, how to get them to the resources. So it also says faculty and staff, right? I think we could easily include coaches in that staff, athletic training staff, administrators within the sport world, that's a critical part of what we do. And so not only do we kind of have to do the college student athlete help within our four walls, right, in our offices, but we also have to make sure to get out there so they know who we are and know how to access services, that we get to the people who have contact with student athletes and let them know about us and who we are. I know at this institution, I do new faculty seminars. I want the new faculty members to know not only who a psychologist is, but who the sports psychologist is. That's really important to me. And when I have any opportunity to do any campus-wide, either non-sport or sport activities, I jump on it because I think it's important for people to know that there's access to services and what those services look like. So now I'm going to go back one slide and talk about an article that I think is important, and I've referenced probably the entire time I've been talking with you, and that is this idea from preparation to execution. Sean McCann, again another USOC sports psychologist, has an awesome article. I give it to a lot of the coaches that I work with. It's actually 4 coaches. It breaks down, and I've only highlighted, I don't know how many I have here, 10 or so different bullet points. He has more than that, and talks about kind of the periodization of kind of being in this practice environment to a competitive mode. And he's talking about it within an Olympic environment, and yet I think this also makes a lot of sense within the college student-athlete environment, where in the week, and I already talked about this, right, during a week, I may be working in very complex ways as a student athlete, right? I might be in the paragraphs, I might be in the past, present, future, kind of any time domain, and yet when it's time for competition, when it's time to execute, right, we're bullet points. We're present only, right? We get down to only the answers. We may move, right, from the abstract during the week, what do you think? What do you feel about this kind of idea? And we get in this abstract way. Come competitive time or execution mode, you are concrete, right? You're action-oriented. You're less. I'll go back a bit to the Dr. Peterson's recommendation about 2 to 3 things that we have to be able to remember. That's one of the reasons I think that this preparation to execution slide makes so sense. It makes so much sense, and Dr. McCann as well. It makes so much sense. Is that she talked about the same thing, and that you boil it down to 2 to 3 things, right? That's all an athlete can concentrate on. The military gets this, right? So Naval Academy, our kind of motto is honor, courage, commitment. right? We develop midshipmen mentally, morally, physically, right? If you look at a lot of different military slogans, you're going to see series of threes. It makes sense. I think it works. And so with our student athletes, like most, 3 things that you're going to be able to consider when competing. So I'm going to go on to how the story ends. And actually, I may be a little bit disappointing because I'm not going to fully end the story for you. But I'm going to talk about closer to the end here. So it's Tuesday before Scott's conference championships. He's been attending counseling regularly. He knows the more that he focuses his time on the outcome and his time, for performance, his times on the weekends, the worse he does. He is insightful about this. He gets it. And he knows it's true for him in both academics and sports. So the more that he focuses on the outcome, the more he focuses on the grade or, the time that he's going to achieve or the place he's going to get, the worse he really does, and it feels worse. At practice and in session, he's during the week, he's working on strategy. So, he's thinking about for the weekend, where does he want to be in the pack, right? When's he going to kick? How he's going to plan for his strengths as an athlete and for the runners around him. Through his work in counseling, he's really become more aware of his optimal mindset. What is his ideal mindset, his optimal mindset for performance, which we learn through simply reviewing, like what are your best performances ever, and how did you feel prior to those performances, right? So we can begin to identify his optimal mindset. He's identified his as being inspired and determined. Right? Those are 2 words that really mean something to him as an athlete, and when he's done his best, he's really felt this inspiration and determination. And in fact, in practice, this is what he's been saying to himself when he goes to train, right? In fact, sometimes he even just boils it down to ID. And he's also for inspiration and determination. And he's also kind of connected with the sound of the starting signal, this kind of pop that happens that really he kind of feels like he's the shooting out, right, of the gun and down the track. And so sometimes I can actually, we talk about how he might begin to use that language consistently, almost as his mantra, right, that he'll even say, like, ID pop, right? And so he begins to kind of get what that sounds like to him. When the starting signal goes off, and again, when he hears that sound of the pop, he just feels that that's when he's the fastest. Friday in calculus class, right, this is a student athlete, so right, he's still got to go to calculus. His mind wanders to racing, right? He can feel his heart race a bit, right, the nervous anticipation of the weekend. And he simply refocuses on feeling inspired and determined and hearing the pop. And he also focuses back in on his calculus class. Right, so now it's Saturday, 5 minutes before his heat. Inspired, determined, pop. On the edge of his hand, right, he's simply written IDP to remind him and to stay focused. That's where my story ends, and I'd look forward to any questions that the group might have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Muller. We have a couple of questions, and please keep sending them in through the question box if you have them. We'll try to get to as many as possible. Dr. Muller, you mentioned a little bit about outreach. One of our questions from Jamie Sawchuk is, how can we educate coaches, athletic trainers, athletic administrators, teammates, pretty much anybody around the student athlete about some of the risks that you talked about?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. One is, I'd be a little bit curious about the provider's involvement within the athletic department. So I think the best recommendation is to get involved, right? Find out what are the kind of regular patterns in the athletic department that would give you the opportunity to have those conversations. Right? So here we have twice a year, we have sports medicine meetings. I attend every single one of them. I prioritize them on my schedule, and I go to those sports medicine meetings, which is an opportunity to speak to all of the sports medicine staff, athletic trainers, and docs. It's a kind of a formal opportunity. They also meet on a weekly basis, and so I occasionally go over to those meetings, and I just sit and have conversations, right, as they begin to wrap up their meetings. Right, I may not have a formal part in the meeting, but I'll sit and talk with those athletic trainers. through those relationships, I have then been able to attend all the first meetings of a team. So an athletic trainer essentially will say, right, this is their first team meeting for the year, and I simply am present, right? That may be not an education opportunity, but at least it's an opportunity for them to see who I am. And not every team is going to take advantage of that, for sure. Some teams say, you know, I really don't want you at that meeting, but I want you at this meeting instead. But really integrating yourself into the athletic department and where it matters most, like who's going to be, and this is a little bit of a military expression, but kind of boots on the ground, who is the closest to the student athletes. And I often find that athletic trainers know the most. They're my kind of strongest allies in this mental health arena. And so that's, you know, through the sports medicine meetings, through those weekly staff meetings, through asking to talk with them, and then also to go to the first team meetings for sports teams is my opportunity to share information about mental health.
All right. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about clarifying or maybe explaining a little bit more about the rates of eating disorders in athletic populations. Kate Hibbard-Gibbons asked about rates maybe going up, going down, or maybe we're just seeing more subclinical diagnoses for athletes with regards to eating disorders.
Oh boy, that's such a great question, and I am not so sure I'm exactly the person to ask that question of, but because I did cite it. So the NCAA has great information on this. They are looking at it. I know that it is higher, not surprisingly so, and as well, you're going to see, of course, in the sports that are the leaner sports, right, and in fact, even the smaller uniforms, right, you're going to see stronger body image distortions. The two people that are really the kind of leading experts in this area that have, you know, published so much on this area is Ron Thompson and Roberta Sherman. They're both wonderful, just kind of advocates for the field, and they have that specific data. So I'm not so sure I have, and in fact, unfortunately I have the data to some degree, but it's on an email, and I can't, because of the way this webinar is done, I can't access my email to find the answer, and so I don't know the specific numbers. But it's a concern, and you know, and this is not just right a female issue. This is it goes across genders. I know in particular we see a lot of also you know, emphasis on being big, right, and how that can also you know, distorted body image relationship to being big and to being small, and our, you know, female male athletes. It's really gender blind.
Yeah. I hope I'm going to say this right, but Ibrahim Moteshari asked about working with athletes who are really far away from their families, maybe in different cities, states, or even countries, and if you have experience with that and how you work with athletes who are, you know, having troubles with homesickness.
Yes. So again, a great question. Homesickness, I think, is a very strong reality for a lot of the student athletes we meet. I think especially in the beginning, where kind of everybody feels uncertain. There's, you know, none of the relationships, you know, fall semester or somebody's freshman year are as close as the relationships you have just left, right? And you're kind of figuring out who your friends are going to be and where those social support networks are. One is I encourage communication, I think in a very simple way, right? So what is going to be the best style of communication for the student athlete? Communication for many is instantaneous, you know, with text messages and emails. But for some, it has to be a bit planned out, and I would absolutely recommend planning a time, right, that fits in everybody's schedule, right, especially if you're looking at time delays and different time zones throughout countries or across countries. Planning for that communication is really important so that you ensure that it happens. I think as well, again, letting people know that you're having a bit of a tough time with being away from people, right? Allowing, you know, sometimes I find student athletes, they kind of have this sense of like, I'm going to be all right, everything's all right, I always make everything all right, and so they sometimes are fearful of kind of telling somebody who's far away, a friend, a parent, right, a guardian, you know, I'm feeling a bit sad and I'd like to be able to speak to you more often, right? And if just the parent or friend knew that, they'd be able to respond accordingly. And yet so often I don't think some of our student athletes are great at saying, I need help. because they're just so used to being such stellar performers. And so to be able to just communicate, you know what, I want to talk to you more often. Even though it's going to be really hard, I'd like to talk to you more often. Or when I talk to you, I want to make sure that this is what we talk about, so that that connection can continue.
All right, I got a two-parter here.
Okay.
From Kelsey Offner and Vince Apple Chiarella. Sorry, everybody, if I'm pronouncing these wrong. First, how do you get around this idea that sports psychology is for athletes who have something wrong with them, kind of the stigma? And then as a second part to that, how do you work with athletes who are maybe resistant to the techniques or interventions and don't want anything to do with you or the work?
Yeah, that happens to all of us. I have not yet figured out the kind of secret to reducing stigma and mental health. It is a hard one. I think my best advice regarding helping that is by integration and integrating in wherever you can. If you're integrated into the kind of standard model for care for a student athlete, I think it can be really helpful. So whatever that care is, so there are times in which I integrate more into strength and conditioning, right? And I talk with our strength and conditioning coaches. We talk about what would recovery look like, even in the weight room when they're lifting, kind of what would optimal performance look like. And so I'm integrating myself into strength and conditioning. And when athletes think about, okay, if I'm going to lift weights to get bigger and stronger, how am I kind of lifting weights in my mind to get more resilient? And I think that while I will often integrate myself into the athletic training model, which is kind of the problem model, I'm just as likely to take time with one of our strength and conditioning coaches and talk to him or her about where I might be able to intervene. So, it's a two-pronged process. One is I spend time talking to teams about performance excellence, right? And the caveat is I always introduce myself as a sport and clinical psychologist so that they understand that not only am I here for performance, but there's a continuum. I didn't put it in this slide deck, but it's a really wonderful continuum that I've seen out there from, I think originated from Nikki Moore, who's now at University of North Carolina, that talks about this continuum of services that a sports psychologist kind of can provide a student athlete. And so I just think thinking of ourselves that way, that I can do all that, and finding the mechanism to do that with your student athlete population, that's how they're going to begin to see you as both of those roles. And then as a sports psychologist, you have to learn how to balance that effectively. When am I going to step a little more into my performance hat, right? When am I going to step a little more into my counseling hat? And I think the performance hat actually reduces the stigma to the I need help, right? Because I can't tell you how many times an athlete comes in and says, Doc, I just need help with, performing better in competition, and 2 sessions in, we're talking about some family issue related to, it just is kind of part of the process. But also, I'm always mindful that they came in here for a performance concern, and I'm going to make sure that I'm addressing that as we talk about these kind of other maybe pressing issues. Did I get to the second part of that question?
Yeah, the working with athletes who are resistant.
Oh. So, you know what? We're only going to be able to change certain minds. And there are some coaches who I will never be able to change their mind. They say hi to me. They're nice to me. They're pleasant to me. But they would never have me come and talk to their team. And I'm all right with that. So how do I get access to those student athletes, though, right? Because that's a little concerning. There could be a whole group of student athletes, right, in a competitive sport that's hard on them, that has no idea there's a sports psychologist that exists. And one of the ways I do that is through aligning with the athletic trainer that works with that sport. They know I'm there. They can tell people that I'm there. It is tough. There are some coaches who still, I don't know if I want to say even that are a bit threatened, but at times, right, could feel uncertain about, how I would fit into the team dynamic, and that I might cause more harm than good.
Sure. Sort of a similar question again from Jeff Harbert. Does this type of work, can it only be done with the individual, or is it possible to work with teams and affect change at that level?
Oh, absolutely, it's possible to affect change with the group. I didn't talk about that in this presentation, but I think team interventions are wonderful. In fact, sometimes you almost can't change the individual athlete without changing the team, and sometimes that can be really hard when you're working with an athlete who's in an environment or in a team dynamic that's not healthy, and you're trying to only change the athlete, and they get reinforced to kind of behave in different ways or feel in different ways, and I mean that's a learning opportunity, but it's definitely a lot harder. I think that there's many ways to get involved with teams and do very similar interventions, right? Whether that's feeding back information to coach about what somebody sees in the team. Although with good confidentiality, and whether that's team meetings, being part of a weekly team meeting in which you're talking about dynamics that contribute to performance and that also may seem to, take away from performance, and the elephants in the room, trying to kind of remove the elephants in the room. I always tell coaches, like, conflict is not a problem. In fact, conflict is a natural part of a competitive athletic team, but it's how you solve that conflict that will either lead to kind of continued team cohesion and success, or potentially break the team down when things get hard. But conflict in itself isn't bad. It's great, right? You get people that want to compete against each other and have some difficulty with that, but resolving it's so important, and that is a team intervention to resolve that conflict, and that happens through consistent meeting with the team.
Sure. I'm going to combine two questions here from Chris Lynch and Sar Chick. Can you talk a little bit about the culture of sport, this idea of toughness, no vulnerabilities, specifically mental toughness as a buzzword in the field, and how you think that affects working with athletes who we know are at higher risk for some of these things, and yet may not be willing or open to being vulnerable to looking at their risk factors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a reality also of the work that we do. I am asked all the time what I think about with mental toughness. I started off this presentation in particular with Joan's definition. I just, because I need a definition, and people who have done research in the areas typically where I go. When I start talking about mental toughness with a coach, I get very sport and team, like this year specific. So when we begin to talk about mental toughness, I will ask them, what is mental toughness on this team? What does that look like? I'm looking at I always try to operationalize mental toughness. So how would I know that an athlete is kind of acting mentally tough at practice? Like, how would a coach observe that? How would I observe that? So I get very specific to the sport and the team that year. And also, I will say mental toughness to me is not just on the field. Mental toughness is off the field. In fact, that's what I think that one of the things I highlighted in my the case study was when Scott, that his freshman year, right, he wasn't kind of mentally tough off the field, right? He was engaging in behaviors that don't contribute to performance. And because it is easier to do it's just easier to like stay up late, and it's easier potentially to kind of check your cell phones all the time and let them interrupt your sleep patterns, right? That can be kind of easier thing to do, and so the lifestyle of an athlete is also can be hard. And so when I talk about mental toughness, I'm talking about on the field, how to operationalize it, and off the field, how do I operationalize it for this team this year? So mental toughness is important to our coaches and to our student athletes. So how then, if we're saying like be tough, does an athlete raise their hand and say, but I'm not tough? And I think that can be hard. Where I look at it is that it's a continuum, and that you have never reached at least I don't think it's possible to ever reach the pinnacle of mental toughness, right? So even a strength and conditioning program, right, they, in the kind of the off season, they may train harder in the weight room, but when it's time to the season starts, right, they don't just stop training, right? They continue to train. They just train in a bit of a different way, and they may reduce. And so I just look at it, it's a training, right? You're not, do I consider you to be weak because you're doing strength and conditioning? No, right, because you're lifting weights. No, this is just one way to train, because everybody can gain. Nobody's at the top. I think once you think like that's it, like you've reached your peak, that's it, right? Then I don't think many athletes would say that that's the case. And so, but I'm going to also add a really important point, and that is coach buy-in. if coach thinks that you're mentally tough when you seek out the sports psychologist, you're more likely to seek out the sports psychologist. So I'm having lots of conversations with coach about the value in this training and seeking me out to help. And if a coach says, like, I did it, you should do it, right, that is going to speak volumes to an athlete. When I do presentations, in fact, I'm often saying, there's some that I'd say, Coach, I don't want you there, right, because we're talking about stuff that may get uncomfortable. But for a lot of them, I want Coach there, and I want Coach to be able to speak to the same thing I'm talking about because I want it to be reinforced. This is the culture of this team. In order to achieve, right, in order to meet our goals, we're going to train physically, we're going to train mentally, we're going to train on the court and the field, and then it just is integrated.
I want to thank everybody for your questions. There are so many that I wish we had time to go through, and unfortunately we are running over, and then out of respect for everyone's time, I just want to close with one more question because I think it's really important for our students and those who are looking to make connections with athletic departments. So Dr. Moeller, could you talk about if there's a student who is interested in doing this kind of work or an early career professional, who would you typically say would be that initial point of contact? Is that the athletic director, a coach, an athletic trainer? How can these connections be made to do the work that you've just talked about?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think, so that's a hard question to answer in some ways because I think every athletic department is different. So I think at a really big school, and we're talking about an athletic department, there'd be no way that kind of junior sports psychology type is going to go and make a call to the athletic director, right? Because you're never going to make it there. So you need to think about the culture of the school, the culture of the sport at the school, kind of, and how you would potentially best fit in there. That's where I think athletic trainers are often a great point of contact. It's how I started. So I was a little of my history is I was actually an extern, so I was a doctoral extern, right? So before I graduated with my doctorate in psychology, I was actually at the Naval Academy as an extern, as a practicum student. While I was here, I made friends with one of the athletic trainers. I called him, I started talking, and I got to hang out in the athletic training room once a week, right? Just to be there and learn and absorb as much as I could. When I came back here 10 years later, that athletic trainer remembered me. He was still here. He actually just retired, and that connection was crucial, I think, to then my integration. And so I do think kind of my kind of best advice is don't act like you know what you're talking about, right? I know what you're talking about, but don't try to sell something that you can't provide. It's much better to be an observer and a listener for a period of time than to even offer suggestions. I often, when asked, like, well, what would you do? I say often it's like, I just need to learn more before I can give an intervention that I think is going to be effective in this moment. So be an incredible listener, hone your observation skills, hone your listening skills so that you can hear the dynamics, the culture, the politics, right, of an athletic department. And once you know those, then proceed with, reaching out to the people that you think are really the best people to connect with.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I just want to close my part of the webinar here by thanking everybody for your participation, especially those who are still with us, even though we went a little bit over time. And certainly want to thank Dr. Jessica Moeller for her time, her energy, her experience, her knowledge. Dr. Moeller, thank you so much. I think this has been really valuable for our attendees. We really appreciate all of your time.
Well, you're welcome. I actually really enjoyed doing it as well, so thank you for having me.
Awesome.